Hello and welcome to the video. It's time for my annual roundup of my kit picks for 2022. Now, I've been doing this for quite a few years now, and it's been interesting over the past 12 months in particular, and due to the pandemic, the innovation that we saw in the hobby in the previous 7 or 8 years as the multi-rotor thing exploded has really slowed down. So it's interesting pulling these slides out and updated them to do a more up-to-date version for summer 2022. How much of these things is actually the same? Now, these are my kit picks. These are incredibly subjective. These are things that I really like, that I trust, that I use here all the time. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, then none of this is going to be news to you at all. It's the stuff that you've seen over and over again. But I think some of the most interesting stuff is actually towards the end. That is the stuff that I personally, as a pilot, will take to the field when I'm flying for just my own fun and enjoyment. What quads, radios, planes, goggles, what systems do I use? And that's probably the most telling one, because lots of us who are lucky enough to get sent stuff for review, play with it, and then very often it just goes into a pile with other things. Occasionally though, something will come along that really captures your imagination, and it becomes one of those things that you take to the field on a regular basis. So let me cover that. Time codes to all the different segments down below. Now, because it has changed so little from last year, I'm not going to go through everything that's on each individual slide, because to be honest, it's all written there. That's a little bit redundant. But what I will do is pull out some of the key things and changes from last year and some of the interesting stuff that's been going on with the hobby in the last 12 months. Now, I won't be providing links to all of the different pieces that I'm going to talk about in this, but everything that I'm going to mention, I've made a video on. So, for example, if you want to see my video on something like the Recon FPV Recon 7 Pro, then if you type in that and add my name at the end, then you should be able to find the videos that I've made on that particular subject. But you can change that to be whatever you want. So if you are not sure about where my videos are, this is the way to find the link for the stuff that I'm about to talk about. So the first one to talk about are hardware flight controllers. You'll see these coming up again and again in the channel if you watch it regularly. For INAV and Betaflight, I'm a big fan of the Matek flight controllers. The way that they publish all of the layouts are fantastic, and it makes wiring a piece of cake. I use the Matek wings along with the Matek F411WTE as it is now for things like the wing builds with INAV, and then for Betaflight I'm using a lot of that Matek stuff. But again, things like the Holybro stuff and stuff like the SpeedyBee flight controllers are pretty nice too. There's also the Holybro Pixhawk versions as well. I prefer those over the clones. The quality just seems to be a lot better. Things like the 5X is now supported, and there's a new version that's just come out as well. And the last one then is the Matek Wing series is also very good for things like Ardupilot, Arduplane in particular. So those are the ones that if you watch, you'll kind of see cropping up again and again. And most of those were on the list last year. Next list is a list that's very close to my heart. Things like flying wings. Now, these might be traditional flying wings that look like wings. They might be planes that are kind of wings for all intents and purposes, but may have an extra control surface or two. My number one, I did a video on this a couple of months ago and it was quite popular. My 4 favourite planes are the AtomRC Dolphin. One of the best planes that I have for the way that I fly. I like to do lots of soaring, longer flight times, lots of HD FPV, that kind of stuff. I'm not interested in mega speeds when I'm flying the Dolphin, but the Dolphin will go very slowly up to very quickly. I'll put a link down below to that other video if you want to go into detail. Other ones that I really like, things like the Diatone Ripper or the He-Wing F1, I think as it's called. Great little plane designed around FPV and comes it's not particularly expensive, but it can go like stink. It doesn't float very well, but really cuts through the air nicely. There's also the He-Wing Ranger T1. That's a little twin plane. That is more of a conventional plane because it has the elevator out the back and the ailerons each side, but again, it's absolutely fantastic. I know lots of people who've tried them who really like them. And then the last one is things like the AR Wing Pro and the old AR Wing. To be honest, I tend to fly that less now. I like the slightly smaller modular, more capable models than the AR Wing Pro. The AR Wing Pro, I would have loved it if they'd have brought out a slightly more compact version of that for easier transport and carry and for making it as a lighter build. If you want something a little bit more exotic, then the right wing Drax, in my humble opinion, are still the best. I think it's only the Mini that's still available at the moment. I have all of mine. They are loud, brash, noisy, but they fly incredibly well. The other thing I like is things like the E-Wings Black Hawk. The Black Hawk, there's a whole range of them. Fortunately, Greg, who's behind E-Wings, it's done as a passion project, so he has a day job. So you tend to find that he only cuts the models out of foam when he can. So supply can be very patchy, to say the least, with things like E-Wings. And then in terms of honourable mentions this year, there aren't any, but there is potentially one or two interesting things coming in the fixed wing category. In terms of fixed wings, there are still lots of great models about that I really like and would recommend. However, an awful lot of those are not new by any stretch of the imagination. They include things like the Hobby King Bixler, the Floater, the Walrus, Tundra, and the AtomRC Killer Whale. More expensive options are things like the Grand Tundra. All of this is kind of Hobby King stuff, with the exception of the Killer Whale. And it's a shame that Hobby King are no longer making this kind of stuff, because they used to be really good at it. The other name you're probably missing from this list is there's no ZOHD stuff on here as well. And that's because, unfortunately, although ZOHD used to be the powerhouse for innovation and exciting products around FPV fixed wing, they really seem to have lost their way recently with the Alpha Strike, which was, yeah, okay, and then the Delta Strike, which was terrible as an EDF plane. Only a couple of other ones to mention. Still like the ZOHD Drift. The Dart used to be my favourite model from those guys, and they've retired it, sadly, and they haven't replaced it with anything. They brought out the Dart 250. I'm not a fan of. It's too small, light and fragile. And then there is also the new Mars plane that I'm building out at the moment. Time will tell how often that gets put in the bag, but signs are good. Maybe when I do an updated video on my favourite planes, the Mars will replace one of my top 4, or maybe even make it into a top 5. Multirotors is an interesting list. There has been a huge constriction of the amount of new products coming along in multirotor land. So very quickly, this list is very, very similar to what it is last time. I, fortunately, in the last 12 months, have lost my Recon 5. So that has gone, which is the one I used to fly all the time. I loved that Recon 5, but unfortunately, that's no longer available to me to fly, which is heartbreaking. Happens to the best of us. But I tend to recommend things like the Emax stuff for the tiny whoops, things like the Mobular, the Petrel. They're all fab indoor flyers. And then for the bigger stuff, it's the same names that I really like. It's your HGLRCs, your GEP-RCs, your Armatans, and even things like the Holy Bro stuff. They make some really nice models when they do, although they haven't brought anything out new for quite a while. Radio controllers, I think for handheld style, I think we've got things like the Tango 2, which is a very nice radio. Common choices, obviously, for radios, the Taranis X9D. Loads of us are still flying those back from when they were the go-to choice. The Radiomaster TX16S, now in version Mark II, is still my choice for a modern multi-protocol radio. And the TBS Mambo is actually a very nice radio if you don't want something that's too big and you're happy to be locked into the TBS ecosystem. Honourable mentions in this list, things like the FreeSky X-Lite, the Jumper T16, the FR Sky X18S, which is a new radio that I have in here that I'm starting to make videos on. That is impressing me. We'll see how that goes over the next couple of months, and that is also allowing me to make videos on the Ethos operating system as well. Analogue FPV goggles, if you want cheap and cheerful, you know, kind of £20, $20, the Quantum Cyclops is still a fantastic way to get into the hobby. The choices for me are for analog goggles, and again, this is based on the stuff that I've had here. I haven't had all of them in, but my HDO2s are the ones that I personally use. Again, we'll come back to all that in a bit. And then I also have things like the Fat Shark Scout. They're fantastic. I think that's also the model that HD0 are basing their new FPV goggles on, and things like the 030 from SkyZone are very good. FPV receiver modules, for me, it's got to be the TBS Fusion or something like the Immersion RC Rapid Fire. Both of those are great because they're modern diversity systems. They don't just listen to one antenna or the other, they're combining the image from both. Everything I use here is using Menace RC antennas, including the latest build that I've just done with the good old aeropods underneath the nose of the plane. Digital FPV goggles, well, this is about to get interesting, isn't it? Because DJI has had a pretty clear run on this. I've been looking at things like the HD0 technology, which Fat Shark was betting on, but have kind of given up that relationship in order for their new system. And then we have the new Fat Shark system that hopefully I'll be getting my hands on soon to have a real proper play and give you an honest opinion of where it is and how it fits on the scale of DJI HD 50 megabit mode and good old Analogue FPV. I've talked about this in the past, but I'm interested to get my hands on the new system and actually fly it when I'm not being paid to review it. Chargers, pretty much the same as last year. SkyRC, my Q200 continues to be the go-to. This 4-port charger is the one I pull out when I have lots of batteries to charge. The 2-port charger that I'm loving at the moment is there behind me. That's the Gens Ace Dual. That's replaced my ISDT D2. I've had good experiences with ISDT, but I know lots of you out there have struggled with quality. Not going to go through this stuff too much. This is all the stuff that I'd recommend. One of the best things on the bench, apart from a multimeter, is the Vifly smoke stopper. This is a fantastic piece of kit. I use it all the time. The reason I really like it is that you have a button on here that you can use to turn on and turn off the voltage, and it will limit the current. It's incredibly useful for doing commissioning on the bench, so that if you do accidentally start the motor, it'll automatically cut the power so that you're protected. But it's also handy for doing daft things like binding radio receivers, where you wish you had one extra hand. You can kind of plug it all in, plug the power in, and then get hold of the bind button and then hit the other button on the smoke stopper, and it will all work. So no real surprises there at all. It's all the stuff that if you watch my channel you'll know that I use, trust, and it's the stuff that gives me a lot of enjoyment. However, this is probably the most important slide. This is the stuff that I personally fly all the time. And again, this looks very similar to the slide that I did this time last year. There's only a couple of changes. The main change on this is that the He-Wing Ranger T1 is now one of those wings that I love to take to the field. It's a little twin and it works incredibly well, and then pretty much everything else is all the same. I'm hoping that if I do this again in 12 months time, the new Fat Shark HD system will be all over this, but time will tell. So in summary, that's a quick whistle-stop tour of the kit that I would recommend if you are coming into the hobby. A lot of it is not the cheap and cheerful stuff, although with the price rises we've seen over the last 2 years, the days of cheap and cheerful stuff in the hobby is kind of behind us anyway. Our days of $20 flight controllers are sadly well behind us. So this is a relative term, but I tend to buy better stuff from manufacturers that I know put a little bit more effort into quality control and checking and making sure that everything that leaves the factory is going to work, rather than buy something on eBay, pay my money, take my choice and hope it's okay. And that's typically because I don't want a servo or something like a flight controller or a GPS or something to let go in the middle of flight and put all of the model at jeopardy, including potentially an action camera I have on the thing as well. For the sake of an extra £20, $30, I'd rather buy the good stuff, and that means that then I've got a lot more faith that the thing's going to get back to me in one piece at the end of the flight. There are some things in the hobby that you will buy once and you will have for a long time. My own Taranis radio was early 2015 and it's still going strong, so that's 7 years I've had that radio now. The HDO goggles, 4 years old now, I think, at this point. The DJI system is at least 3 years old. So although some of this stuff might be relatively expensive, it's not stuff that you upgrade and change every year unless you made a money. So I would get the best charger, radio, goggles that you can, and that way then it's an investment in the hobby. Because if you figure out how much it's going to cost you if you have that stuff for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it's actually buttons for an awful lot of enjoyment, and that stuff is less likely to let you down. So hopefully that's been interesting for those of you that kind of interested in the kind of stuff that I get up to and fly. Obviously, one of the things that isn't on this list are things like my new helicopter love, and I'm sure when I come to do this next year, it'll be interesting to see if helicopters are still a passion of mine. But I've been really enjoying playing with things like the M2, and it's igniting a very old passion of mine of radio control. So if you have anything that you're flying that you think I would get a buzz out of, then do put the details down below. I have had some fantastic suggestions over the last year, and a couple of my favourite models, the AtomRC Dolphin and the Hewing Ranger T1, actually came from buddies of mine actually telling me that these were worth a look. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organised into easy to follow playlists that if you're trying to learn a topic will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.